Okay, welcome everyone. So today, welcome to the next episode of Crafting Leadership podcast. My name is Mac. I'm a principal craftsperson at Codurance, and today I have the pleasure to have with me Rowan and Matsi.
Hi, I'm Rowan. I'm a software craftsperson at Codurance.
And I'm Matsi. I'm also a software craftsperson at Codurance. Nice to meet you.
Awesome. Nice to have you guys. So today the subject is innovation seeking, which we know that should be, not always is, but should be like a natural part of our day-to-day work, let's say in projects, IT projects. So I'm interested, what does that mean for you, like seeking innovations? Or maybe you can bring in some kind of a example from your experience, what that looked like on some of your projects, let's say, just to give a bit of foundation before we go into like how to actually materialize some of the ideas you have for innovation seeking, how to communicate to your stakeholders, to your product owners, the need for that. And once you get some successes, with how to keep the momentum going, let's say. So, Rowan, would you like to start?
So yeah, innovation for me is really about identifying why do you need to innovate. It usually starts with functional requirements from customers. Sometimes it can be sort of more ways of working in your team to try and get things done better, more efficiently, to a higher standard. You kind of have to think about the functional requirements of what the customer wants and the way sort of your team gives your output, rather than, I would say, like the code or like what the product's actually doing. You need to start with sort of why first, and then you can figure out how, and that's when you sort of get into the code a bit, and then you could sort of expand on that. And as an individual developer such as myself, you sort of have to think, how do I say not stagnate the program? I think there's a big element to it, I think, is sort of innovating on a personal level rather than just thinking about the product itself. Because if you approach any kind of like software development project, you don't just want to use the knowledge you already have. You should always be looking to improve your own skills and knowledge, maybe learn some new tools, and then that can help drive. That can sort of answer the how you innovate. You still need to come in with this why. To say, why am I doing this? There's no point in saying, I'm going to make this application run 1,000,000 times faster. That would be so good if it doesn't have a use case for it. It's not really innovating if there's no point to it.
So there should be some kind of a foundation, and there should be actually a why for the project. It should have like its mission and vision, which then naturally brings up this need for innovation, because we know that most of the like statements of work and the backlog is, we need to do those things, but usually they are missing some things in order for this deliverable to be delivered in a holistic fashion. So, Matsi?
So there's a whole bunch of stuff to go into there, but I like the point that Rome was making about how it's about learning, about your expertise and experience. I can think of times when I've certainly innovated on a number of projects in which it wasn't necessarily difficult, right? Because it doesn't have to be something totally novel to you if it's novel to your client. So there are some times where you can walk into a project and there are so many ways, so many places to improve. You're almost tripping over things that they're not doing right. They could be doing better. And just by bringing your expertise in and saying, well, I've done it this way before, and actually this way has these benefits, then you can pretty quickly innovate in all sorts of ways that they've not seen before, right? But then the extension of that is, well, what if you end up in a situation where actually they're a really well-run team, there's not much from your expertise, from your experience that you can improve on, then maybe that's a situation where to find areas to improve, you need to look at other people's experience, look at the literature, look at if you're sort of reaching the edge of your knowledge, look for what other experts in the field are saying on, oh, you should try this, you should try that, there's this technique, this tool, and you can sort of find innovation that way. It certainly happened somewhat recently to me that I ended up doing a little bit of both on a recent project where the client had all sorts of problems with their development, whole process and development experience. And we were introducing fairly straightforward things like linting and type checking and all sorts to improve their processes. But then we were also working in a technology stack I wasn't terribly familiar with. So there's also lots to learn there. And we were delving into the literature and the books that the experts had written in this. It was a somewhat niche bit of technology. And you want to find and identify those people who really know what they're talking about and listen to them carefully and see what ideas they have will be applicable in your situation.
That's very interesting what you mentioned. It's that lending that you mentioned, it seems to be like a small thing potentially, right? But in the end can go a long way. And it's something that didn't came from the top, right? You should be doing those things, but it came naturally as a maybe it's not like super necessary, but it greatly improves the day-to-day work for you as well. And then obviously the safety of the application that you're checking in as well.
You mentioned before how we sort of present these things to stakeholders, and yeah, that one in particular and a number of other ones in that project just kind of came along naturally. Like it seemed like such an obvious thing to do and such an obvious benefit, and we just went ahead and presented to them and said, here's another thing we'd like to do, and here's the benefits we think it'll have to you. And the stakeholders were really interested and were more than happy for us to make these changes. And by doing that, we're able to sort of, once you have your foot in the door and you're doing some work for a client, you're able to say, okay, yes, we'll deliver that, and what's more, we'll deliver this, that, and the other as well. And really improve, give them more than they bargained for and give them a really good experience. But as to specifically how you deliver that to a stakeholder, or how you sort of present your ideas, I'm not sure there's much trick to it other than just to make sure you have a good sort of camaraderie, a good relationship with your stakeholder, and that you're communicating regularly with them. And at one of your regular communications, whether that's at sort of a weekly meeting or at a demo or planning session or something like this, just bring it up and say, well, hey, here's this thing I think is a good idea. Have a clear argument you've prepared beforehand to explain why you'd like to do this, and just have that discussion.
I think it's about building up the trust, isn't it? And I like the example you gave before about like experience you've had on previous projects. I like to think, as developers, as we work on more and more projects in our lives, whether it's different clients as a consultant or just different places you've worked at, or even personal things, you start to build up kind of like your own personal standard for what a project should look like, sort of in a holistic way, beyond just the code. If you're thinking about sort of DevOps side sort of stuff, how stable is your application and is it well monitored, all this kind of stuff. And so you can bring this whole sort of stack of experience to a client or customer and say, look, this is all the stuff, it could improve it in one way. So maybe we start with a really small part of that. And then, they could be excited by all these things. But if you start by the ones that you can implement quite easily or get big benefit out of, then you start to build up that trust straight away with something. You can pick something that isn't likely to fail to sort of start, getting that trust. And
I think that's a really good point. You kind of build up these things, and then when you go to a client, you have a whole listener of things you can just deploy quickly and be like, well, here's something I've done in the past, I've learned. I remember my very first job joining this a bit of a cowboy operation, really, like doing very basic things, like when they wanted to deploy their application, they just copy pasted it onto a network drive from the server. Like very
The good old days, yeah.
And one of the things they said to me, because that was obviously my first job, I was very junior. They said to me, "Oh, we like to hire juniors because they're blank slates, are fresh We can, teach them how it is. We don't get a bunch of experienced developers coming in here telling us what to do. And at the time, that sort of made sense to me. And it wasn't until years later, and I was one of those experienced developers, that turned around and realized, like, you should have listened. You should have gotten an experienced developer in and actually, listened to what they were saying. But yeah, that comes with time. You come to see these things.
It's quite an interesting point, actually. How the industry sort of evolves over time as a whole. There's innovation that sort of say happens as a standard. If you go into a project yourself and bring in all of these different sort of methodologies, like that, it's nothing good to or amazing for you, but the client's never seen it before. That stuff over time starts to sort of build up this industry standard, right? So say you could go to a client and rework the whole architecture to be like microservices and super scalable or something. It's going to get to the point, and I don't think it's too far away, where no one's going to see that as innovation anymore because everyone's sort of doing it. And I thought about this because of your example about this whole copying and pasting a file over. I was trying to explain to a junior person the other day, like how sort of continuous deployment, like the benefits of it compared to that sort of system, but they didn't have that context of having to like deploy in a really difficult, annoying way like that. So kind of like, well, I'm explaining to you what might seem standard, but this is how it used to be, and it was innovated to the point now where it's not different.
I wonder if there's a bit of a if you've ever heard this funny analogy about the sailors and their limes. I don't know if that rings a bell. There's this idea that, and I don't know whether it's actually accurate historically or whether it's just a kind of fable, but the idea is that limes were used by sailors to cure scurvy. So they would go out and bring lots and lots of limes on their voyages and always be eating these limes because it gives them the right nutrition to avoid getting scurvy when they're out for sea weeks and months. But eventually someone would say, why are we eating all these limes? These things are disgusting. What's the point? And if no one who remembered the problem was around, they'd be like, oh, I don't know, let's just stop. Then everyone would get scurvy again. And then it'd be like, oh no, what do we do now? Oh, we should start eating limes. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, bring the limes to a thing. And they get this journey of up and down of being like, discover the problem, solve the problem. Why are we doing this? Stop doing it. The problem comes back, rediscover the solution. I wonder if there's something like that in the industry when you talk about, it's funny to me thinking about, like I said, I came in a bit of a cowboy operation as a junior, and I saw all these problems up front and then understood why the solutions were necessary. But if you're coming in as a junior into the software industry, much more mature as it is today than when we started, then you have to learn all these things up front. You have to learn about CI/CD and deployments and all these test pipelines and different methods of testing and everything. There's a lot to learn up front. And I can imagine some people might just turn around and start questioning that without necessarily, because they've not been through the pain, not necessarily understanding why we got there in the first place, right?
So, guys, in terms of if we go back a bit to we know that all those pain points are there on a project. You're down writing all the code and trying to deliver things, but sometimes we need to do something extra, like you mentioned, like maybe create some pipelines, do some platforming work, and let's say lays the foundations for smooth development, let's say. And this was not in the original statement of work, right? So I guess you mentioned that most likely it's best not to go like big bang and go to your stakeholders, say we need to do all those things, we need 2-3 months before we do anything that you want us to do. So would you go for starting small, let's say, going for those low-hanging fruits? And would you, like you mentioned, Matsi, just go in there with a proposal, or actually go in there with the initial, let's say, working skeleton of that innovation that you would like to bring in forward, let's say?
I think it depends maybe regarding the, creating a working skeleton, creating a sort of proof of concept of your innovation, whatever it is. That just depends on how difficult it is to do. If it's something you can set up very quickly and then demonstrate, and that's what I did in the case of the linting we were discussing earlier, that example. We just set up a very, took like 5 minutes, very basic linter just to demonstrate the concept and what advantages I would get from it. So regarding the low-hanging fruit, I think it's an interesting point as well, because I can think of like lots of good consultants I've worked with over my years at Codurance, and all the best consultants I've worked with have this like uncanny ability to just hone in on the tasks that give high value and have low effort, right? If you can find those things that are actually very basic to solve, but which have a high impact on a number of people, then that's your gold mine as a consultant, right? That's the kind of thing you want to just immediately target those, find those tasks where they are, and you can immediately demonstrate your value to the stakeholder and show them what they're getting out of this engagement with you. Those kind of innovations where you don't actually need to put in that much effort and you get a lot of value out of it, those are, yeah, absolute gems. And some people have been doing this for years and years and years, just seem to have an uncanny ability to identify those.
So there's a bit of a strategy planning, right? In some way, like how to pitch those things to your stakeholder in some way, right? So it's not, I mean, sometimes you have a stakeholder that's, they'll be asking actually maybe some for innovations, which happens, but it's not that often. Usually you as a developer or you as a team ideally should collectively try to aim for these. And always like strike, at least from my perspective, strike a balance between, should I just show what we would like to achieve, how this innovation can help us, so without creating anything tangible, or actually on the other side of the spectrum creating like a proof of concept, and only once that is there, show to the customer. It's always for me like a balance, like somewhere in between that spectrum, because if you just show the theory, there wouldn't be anything tangible. They maybe get bored, or they just don't see that working, let's say. So they wouldn't be so inclined to say yes. But on the other hand, if you show this huge proof of concept, okay, everything is working, they maybe, shouldn't you actually be working on those other things I asked from you, right? So I think it's, from my experience, not sure with you guys, this is like figuring out like how, like, where in that spectrum should I like pitch this thing, right, and prepare for the pitch.
I feel like from,
sorry, go on.
I feel like from my experience, I don't know whether this is a good point or a bad point, and it's maybe sort of depends on the situation. But I think like personal bias can actually help quite a lot here. You know, as experienced developers, I think we tend to individually like find areas we love in development and things we like to play around with. You might find someone who, like me, I really like sort of stability, platform engineering side of development. Other people might be really into like making things efficient, or really into linting, like Matsi was talking about, and setting those coding standards. And I think if you find people passionate about those things, you're going to go into a project, notice those things where you could add big benefit early, because they're things you think about all the time. But because you're interested and you do them often, you're probably going to be faster than the average person at implementing these things, and you can you can do those before anything else. You might be able to sort of fit those in at the start. And here's where it sort of may or may not be the best strategy, because they might not necessarily be the best things to add. But as long as you make sure they are relevant for the customer, you can show them things quickly. And like we were talking about before, you can sort of guarantee somewhat that they're going to work, or at least have like less chance of failure, because they're things that you're knowledgeable in.
That's very interesting. So in some way you might say that it's in the area of like quality leadership, like being aware of your team members' passions and strengths, and then also being aware what stakeholder might see beneficial and will give a green light, let's say. So that's always that up to the leader of that team, let's say, to be always aware of those both sides, right, and make the correct decisions based on that.
Maybe that's another form of looking for innovations, right? On your team and in a wider view as well, to your other colleagues who may not even be on your team, hunting for people who have a particular expertise in something your client needs and something your client's working on, and saying, can you think of anything we could do here to innovate? Is there anything we could be doing here, anything novel that we might have missed?
You could probably take it the other way as well and say, out of all your requirements, are there any sort of specific ways you want to do any of these things for whatever reason? And any they don't give a specific approach for, that's your gaps to innovate. And if you do have a team and they sort of all have their own interests, then you could try and align your team members with these different areas and see what you could add in there.
Interesting. Okay, so in terms of right, so how can we take this? Let's say we managed to innovate, and it seems that it may be like a more general thing that could be used to be outside of our project, right? Like from your experience, have you tried like pushing this out so that it can be valuable like outside of your team? Or what do you think maybe some tools, techniques, or things that you could use in order to like bring this out even further, right? So not only like isolate this innovation within your team and just to let other teams figure it out by themselves, but actually spread that like good word in some way and success.
It can be a difficult thing to do because at that point you're getting into sort of culture change, right? I can remember one business I used to work for. I sort of came in, and they had a lot of anti-practices, a lot of really bad practices in just about every way you can think. Really, they were really struggling to get out much useful software at all. And I became quite involved in one team and was pushing them in lots of different ways. I convinced them to try out Scrum to begin with. I didn't really have a project methodology before that at all. I convinced them to try Scrum, and then through the retros, one by one, I was adding new ideas and saying, well, we're seeing this problem, I'm going to try this, and just sort of getting us more and more into an agile way of working and improving all sorts of practices. And around the time I left that job, being really satisfied that this team was looking so much healthier than it was to begin with, someone else from the business came in and with a very clear agenda intended to just undo all the changes I'd made and go back to operating in a different way. So it's a good point. You need to be if your sort of innovations you're looking to push are going to be successful, you need to also be looking at how do I spread this to the rest of the business? How do I make sure this is going to be a lasting change outside of my team as well? And that's not easy to do. You can do things like, we've tried seminars and these community of practice calls, just sort of presenting ideas to people and talking about, I think, not just the ideas. I think the really useful thing is if you can demonstrate that you've actually done it and practiced it within their environment and how it's worked, right? Because the classic answer is, oh, well, that's a nice idea, but it won't work for us. And if you can show, well, I'm working in the same environment and the same code base and the same such and such as you are, and I've done it this way and it's worked really well, and we've had these benefits from it, then that's a really compelling argument you can demonstrate to people. But
so basically,
I was just going to say it's not an easy thing to do. That's it's a struggle.
But it seems that obviously there are like two options, right? So if you would like to spread a word about, so let's say, a new framework, there's a new Java framework, you can spin up a seminar or do a community of practice around and just go through the theory, like what it is, why is it better, or you can actually try to implement it, even in a small way, in your current project, and show how that benefits that team's work and show it to the rest of the organization. That seems to be potentially bringing far more impact than just, hey, this is great and these are the theoretical things that I can show you about it. So it's always better to like use it and then show within that company systems how that works and how it benefits potentially some other teams.
Absolutely. I think it ties back into what we were saying before as well about, do you present it to them as an idea or do you come up with a proof of concept? I think the third like possibility there is also you just do it. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. You just go to them and say, we've done this and here are the benefits, and then see what they make of it. I think that's a bit more of a risky move to make. But I think as long as it isn't something you're investing too much time in, so long as you don't turn around and say, oh, we spent the last 2 weeks doing something you didn't ask us to do, so long as it is just a small task, I think that can be a worthwhile approach as well.
It's funny because it actually it ties in with that whole point, ties in the not the just go ahead and do it, but the whole idea of, say, telling people versus showing them. It ties in with a sort of an extra bit I took from sort of Mac's question, which is, instead of just how can you spread this stuff sort of internally as a culture, how could you spread your ideas or your innovations industry wide? And in my mind, it's sort of, I could kind of come up with two, let's say, direct right ways. One, you could come up with like videos or blog posts or something like that, and you have ideas about things that you can change. And obviously, if you go on write a blog post like, hey, everyone's doing this wrong, you should do it this way, it's better, there's going to be a lot of people, skeptical people, and people like, you know, I don't know, I don't really want to try that out, it sounds risky, or like you're wrong or something like that. But the other part is, if you create like content, like share an open source project or something on GitHub, you actually implement things and show people directly, look, here's something, or we've done it this way, it works, you can have the code and do it yourself. You have that sort of, that extra backing there of, look, we've done it and it works, and you can try it for yourself, and then you're innovating at that scale, because anyone can go and pick this stuff up.
Mm-hmm. So, like, in some of your projects, I'm quite interested. Let's say, was there like a more strategic approach to innovations, in a way that it's not just like various people in the team, every now and then they come up with something, and then maybe it goes, it doesn't go, but there's like a more structured way of keeping those innovations. There's like a backlog of innovation ideas, and it's you talk about it like every retro or something like this, which ones we should take, which ones we should bring into the stakeholder, or it was always, if something pops up, more like on an ad hoc basis. So I'm just wondering, was there more like a structured way in any of your previous projects?
I would say for my ones, my past couple of clients, both have been quite structured. The first one I'm thinking about, we went in and we were modernizing their whole application. They didn't really know what that was going to look like or how that was going to happen, but they knew that it needed to be more modern, and they were really open to modernization in general and improvement. They just didn't really know how to do it. So we were able to go in and identify their current system and identify the gaps. There were certain parts there that we sort of had to try and sell as an extra, let's say. So for instance, they had a Azure pipeline, and it was using the sort of classic pipelines in Azure. Many of you are familiar with that. There were strategies we wanted to do that didn't really lend itself to that, so we wanted to switch to YAML pipelines. And there was all kinds of innovations we can add on top of that. There were certain, I don't know if you call them innovations, there were certain parts of that we had to improve or update because this new system, because the non-YAML one is like basically going legacy, and so they've stopped supporting some of the functionality in it. So we had to make those changes and those improvements. But we were very much in a position where we were able to say, look, you're on this, you're old, this is the best way to do it. And I was lucky because the client was really into just, they were like, yeah, we want everything done best way possible, just don't know how that is. So maybe it was kind of a golden ticket to innovation.
Which is like the modernization project, right? So that's the only thing you do as a team, is actually try to modernize. You're not focused on bringing in new features, but actually improving the existing systems and ways of working. So this is like, as you mentioned,
it was weird actually, because there very much was a task. It wasn't just sort of modernization, innovation, but I think we were able to outshine the base task with the modernization we bought. We added so much more value than they wanted by doing some of the innovation work. There was quite a lot of framework in this project. There was quite a lot of UI work, And instead of spending all this time just basically replicating UI from the old app to the new app, we gave them a framework that they could work with, so they could do it themselves and basically do the easy bit. And we were able to repurpose our time to go and add more and more innovation. So by doing that, we gave them much more value than they initially asked for. And then the second client I had, we went in as a team. They knew their application was kind of, in their words, bad, but it actually wasn't as bad as they thought it was. They were sort of like, yeah, we're on a release tight deadline, but we're really interested to hear what you think in terms of how we can improve it or innovate it. So we went away, we analyzed it for a bit, and we gave them a huge list. And then over time, you can sort of try and start pulling bits in. But I think we were in quite a tough spot where the deadlines set by the business were really, really tight. So you've established that list of ways you can innovate or improvements to the product, but you kind of have to fight for them still as you go, even though they know what they are and they know the benefit. It can be a tricky one.
So basically, you managed to, while still having a task of delivering certain features, to win a large chunk of your time for doing improvements, innovations, and modernizing as well.
Yeah, I guess it depends how much the client values the benefits they're getting from innovation. The first place, it was quite a small client, so we were able to sort of show from a big business perspective, if we do all of this innovation, this is the benefits you're going to be able to get. The second client I was talking about was very much a huge company, so any sort of improvements we could show them for their system didn't necessarily translate to the whole business. We weren't in a position to talk to people higher up, like stakeholders, where it sort of maybe mattered more. We very much had a low scope in this place, so we could give great ideas, but because it's hard from a business perspective to potentially sell them, it's hard to, it's hard. The balance changes where actually you just have to deliver more tasks rather than innovating. But yeah, it sort of all ties into, can you sell it to the client, and are you in a right position with the right person to make that sales pitch at the scale you'd like it to go, really.
So this brings a question: do we always, when we are proposing this kind of a innovation idea, bring in how would this help the business, right? Or not necessarily that's the case. Maybe just sometimes you want to improve developer productivity, and then naturally things will get faster, but it's like a more long-term thing, right? So should we always at least strive to bring in that business value? Usually they're looking for more short-term or medium-term. I mean, the long-term we know about for sure. But I'm just wondering, in your case, is it you think it's beneficial to always try to bring in any potential for direct business value with this innovation?
Most meaningful innovation opportunities you get are long-term goals. It's quite hard, from at least the experiences I've had, to get some of these quick wins, at least from a business case perspective. The way I like to look at businesses is, at the end of the day, the number one thing you can always go back to is, how much money is this making you, or how much money is this saving you? And lots of these things, you don't necessarily get that quick impact unless you're just specifically going out of your way to optimize a system.
Okay, so one more question before we go. Are there situations where maybe it is not advisable, or it is strictly inappropriate in certain projects or certain stages of a project to innovate? You should actually focus on your statement of work, and that's it. You shouldn't actually look at innovating. Is that the case? Maybe from your experience, you had similar situations, or you always should be on the lookout for some kind of innovations?
I think that's a good question. Maybe the whole innovation thing is very open, right, as a phrase. What do we mean by that? And there's all sorts of innovations you can do we look at really big companies like Apple and Google, they innovate in ways that are sometimes anti-competitive. And so Google and Apple, for example, were caught working together to sort of collude to push down salaries for engineers by setting their salaries at places they agreed on between themselves, right, which wasn't entirely legal. And that was very innovative. No one else was doing that. Very innovative, very novel idea. It just wasn't a good idea, right? It's had consequences. Had consequences that perhaps drove up their share price in some maybe even measurable fashion, but it also had consequences on the industry and on people in other tangible ways outside of just money and shareholder value. And ultimately, it had some kind of effect on their shareholder value as well, because they had to settle it in court. But yeah, there's definitely, you shouldn't just chase innovation the disregards to anything else, right? There's lots of other things that are equally important, just as you shouldn't chase, as it were, shareholder value or whatever metric, of money at the cost of anything else.
I can only think of a bad example of that, because similar to the one you gave, one we spoke about recently actually, was something I brought up, the idea that Apple kind of innovated the whole sort of this support system where basically no one else can go and tamper with our products. You have to come to us to fix your stuff. And it's like, okay, I hate that. I think a lot of people hate that, and it's too overpriced. But it's kind of working for them despite the fact that people don't like it. So I'm like,
exactly, yeah, and that brought in the whole right to repair argument, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that's definitely an innovation. No one else was doing that, but it has actually had really bad consequences for people and for society. While it probably has, again, given them a tangible, measurable increase in their shareholder value and their money and their income. But it is bad for society, so it's not necessarily a good innovation and not necessarily something that was actually worthwhile really doing.
It's proliferating as well, right? You look at Tesla, who charge crazy money to fix their cars, and I think they have like subscription-based stuff, but they still very much lock it down so no one else can touch their machines.
Yeah, I won't try to name specific brands because I'll probably get them wrong, but I think several major brands are doing the exact same sort of thing now, and they're all releasing like these highly proprietary custom parts. I think there was a story just yesterday about HP, who, if you use a non-HP ink cartridge in their like newest printers, they will just brick the printer. They'll just lock it down and stop it working altogether. Which, yeah.
I've got a printer like that from HP, and you can't even put like their own stuff in extra unless you get it through a subscription. They force you to put in ink cartridges through their subscription. It's
absolutely mad.
So that's interesting. So we got a bit of a like industry innovation seeking in the wrong areas, let's say, right? So from my perspective, I would say, when you think like, should as a team would be innovating, is it appropriate right now? It's most likely at the very beginning of the project that is very appropriate, and most likely so that you set up the foundations for the latter part of the project, the rest of the project. But once kind of that is, you settle that out, you figure out with the team and stakeholders fine, then most likely that next couple of sprints, you should be focused on delivering that core value that stakeholder expects. And once that is there, you show that you can bring that value that he expects, she expects. Then that's, you can like embellish your team's work with that innovation seeking as well. So that's from my experience.
I think it depends why you're with the client as well, as it's been put before. Like, as consultants, we don't go to places where everything is perfect. We go to situations where we're needed. And if you turn up somewhere and they might just have a really desperate requirement to get things out faster, they just need stuff done. If you literally don't have the space to innovate, but it's just really what they need is to not just do what they want basically to follow this path, then it can limit it. I think to a small extent you might be able to get away with innovations. I like to think of it in the same way as something like clean code, where you take like the Boy Scout approach, always leave it in a place in a way better than it started. If you're able to add small innovations into the everyday work you do, where it's not so big that you have to get someone's approval or attention, where the customer themselves might not necessarily be seeing it, let's say from a non-technical perspective, but it doesn't really take up much more of your time, and it is improving their product. You could still try and squeeze in little bits, but it's going to be quite a hard balance in that situation.
I think there's also, when it comes to situations where it's not appropriate, you also have to think about risk, right? Not necessarily every innovation comes with any risk. If it's something small that you're well practiced and you know very well, maybe it's risk-free. But if it's something that's more on the periphery of your experience, if it's something if you're testing out a technique that's new to you personally, you haven't tried before, then there's a risk that it might just not work, or it might turn out to be inappropriate, or you might invest a bunch of time in it. You might convince the stakeholders this is a good idea, invest a lot of effort into it, and then realize, oh, actually, this wasn't a great idea. It turns out, for one reason or another, this wasn't the right decision.
I was going to say, I have a great example for that, actually. My very first job out of uni, I worked at a place, and we made hardware for banks and stuff, and we made applications for all these different banks, and they were all based off of the same thing, but you kind of customize how it worked through like database customization. And the database like setting up took like 2 weeks per client app, and I was like, there must be a way to speed this up. And we had a tool that helped us, but it's still, even with that, it took 2 weeks. So I said to my boss, can we improve this? He was like, yeah, but it has to work, because the time you spend developing that is time you're spending not creating custom applications. So if it doesn't work at the end, then you've just created a huge backlog of work. And luckily it worked in that instance, which was great, because it took the 2 weeks down to like 2 hours per client app. But if it hadn't worked, it took like 3 or 4 weeks to make. That's 2 clients potentially that you haven't fulfilled.
Yeah, that's the old XACD, right? You've got to estimate very carefully, is this going to save me more time and I'm going to spend trying to save time? And that's an unknowable thing. You can only estimate as best as you can. I think the other sort of analogy I like for it is the classic kind of architecture analogy. Say if someone's building you a bridge, you're asking them to build you a Clifton suspension bridge, and they turn around and say, oh, we've got this really innovative new way of building a bridge. We're going to use these funny new materials. We're going to try a whole new approach. It's going to be radical. You might well turn around and say, well, that sounds really interesting, but actually, I don't want to take the risk of trying something new. What if this bridge doesn't work right? What if there are all sorts of undiscovered problems because no one's done it before? I just want to build a bridge out of brick and steel that's been done 1,000 times before, and we know it's going to work, and just have it work. And that would be quite a appropriate and fair response, really, wouldn't it? Who could blame them for that? So you have to kind of keep in mind your stakeholder might feel that way and may well be very much justified.
I like the bit you talked about them just sort of accepting the downside as well. I've heard this term. So yeah, I've heard this less in terms of innovation, but it's usually something like a client has to do a certain thing, and it's often to do with like compliancy. But if they don't fulfill it, they get like a big fine or something. But sometimes they look at it and they work out the cost, and they're like, actually, it's going to cost more to develop than the fine is going to be, so we'll accept the fine. And I think it could probably map to innovation in those sort of ways. You could say, oh, we could save you 10% a year to do this, but it will cost you X, and they might only be looking at certain time frame of budget and be like, no, we don't care about that cost saving in this sort of time frame, so let's not do it.
That's another one where you've got to be careful about what that compliance is, right? So it kind of depends on the context a lot. But if you look at Volkswagen and the way they cheated emission scandals, and then they were hit by a big fine for it, maybe they knew that fine was coming and they just decided, well, it's worth it. We'll pump extra carbon into the air, however much it was, every year, and then we'll get slapped by a big fine. But the money we'll make out of doing that might be better, Always got to have those those things in mind as well.
I always come back to the example that Sandro gives in like some of his talks about how he worked for like a trading platform or something, and they had to send off like reports of all their trades, and they're up to a deadline, and instead of like the trades basically weren't readable, but the requirement for them as a company was that they had to send the trades. If they weren't readable, that was a problem for later. As long as they sent them in time in an unreadable format, that still fulfilled the requirement. And so sometimes you've got this really weird balance of, you know, the client will tell you certain things you want to do or they want sometimes, and it might make no sense at all to you, and it might, you know, completely prohibit innovation. It might make you think, oh, I have to innovate in a different way. But they'll have really weird requirements that you just might not understand, and you just sort of have to roll with and do the best you can.
So we're basically going into the area which we can go for like another episode, to be honest, where it's innovation is necessary, required because of some compliance, regulation, or legal things. And as you mentioned, a lot of those times it may not actually be really innovating, but doing something like counterproductive, really, or something organically would not happen, right? So, but I guess we are at the end of our session. Guys, just one or two sentences as a summary, the key points, takeaways from this discussion from your side.
Innovation doesn't have to be difficult. Look out for opportunities at your client. Use your experience and your expertise from your past, and just look at what you know works and then not doing. And always keep in mind human factors aside from just making money when you're looking at innovating.
I'd say, make sure your innovation has purpose. Don't innovate for the sake of you think it's better. Make sure that it does have a reason and an outcome that's measurable, I guess. And yeah, my other tip from before, I think people should start with what they enjoy as a place to show quick, meaningful improvement.
Cool. From my side, as a team lead, don't wait for that big bang innovation green light from your stakeholder that it will be allowed. Try to create like a culture within your team, at least, of that innovation seeking in the smallest manner possible, obviously, as well. But don't wait for that big day that, you know, the stakeholder will allow you to work for 2 months on innovations. That most likely won't happen. Thank you very much, guys. That was a great discussion. Yeah, click subscribe, like the video. Yeah, I'll see you in the next episode, guys. Take care.
Cheers.
Cheers.